We're in Moscow tonight. We're here to interview the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin.
Imagine you've been given the chance to interview the most prolific killer of the 21st century, responsible for the bloodshed of hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine, Georgia, Syria. Surely the first thing you'd want to find out is why. Why does he kill? Is it out of sadistic pleasure, political reasons, economic gain, refined ambition? Unfortunately, Tucker Carlson failed to ask any of these questions to Vladimir Putin, who is officially wanted by the International Criminal Court for the abduction of Ukrainian children. The Russian tyrant spent 2 hours of his interview misleading the American public with the sole purpose of making them forget that Russia's war is aimed not only at the destruction of Ukraine, but also at the demise of the United States, its allies, and the entire world order. It's like a magician distracting you with one hand while performing the trick with the other. The Russian tyrant delivered to Carlson a lengthy lecture on history, devoid of any truth, merely a product of a mentally disturbed individual's imagination, whose rantings the world is forced to endure simply because he controls a nuclear button. The Russian tyrant cynically implied that Wall Street Journal journalist Evan Gershkovich is not, as official Russian institutions insist, an American spy, but merely a hostage of Russian special services, whom the Kremlin wants to exchange for their hitman convicted in Germany for murder. The Russian tyrant, whose low-tech economy is merely a raw material appendage of China and accounts for 3% of the global GDP, arrogantly suggests that America, with its 20% of the global GDP, should focus on its national debt issues rather than helping Ukraine. Have you nothing else to do? Wouldn't it be better to come to an agreement with Russia? Putin says, thereby revealing the real goal of his meeting with Carlson. Putin's goal is to convince the American public to cease their support for Ukrainians defending themselves. It is precisely this American assistance that has become the critical factor preventing Russia from defeating Ukraine. Even a relatively small supply of arms from the US and Western countries has resulted in the Russian military losing 300,000 personnel and tens of thousands of pieces of equipment to date. Putin then wondered how to convince Americans not to help the innocent Ukrainian women and children who are bombarded daily by Russia with missiles and drones. A solution was found. To achieve this, it was necessary to claim that Russia does not kill women and children, but is fighting against a new incarnation of Nazism. Carlson's counterpart dedicated 120 minutes of tedious monologue to this cartoonish narrative, forcing the journalist and his audience to barely suppress their yawns. In Putin's version of the world, Ukraine does not exist for 1,000 years, but supposedly less than 100. In Putin's world, the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine is allegedly ancestral Russian lands, which have been part of the Russian state for centuries. In Putin's version of the world, in 2014, the Ukrainian people did not overthrow a Kremlin puppet as part of defending their democratic right to revolt against a tyrannical ruler, but staged a bloody coup to establish a Nazi regime with direct support from the CIA. In Putin's world, what happened in the following 8 years is not Kyiv's legitimate fight against well-armed Russian proxies who invaded eastern Ukraine, but the shooting of unarmed tractor drivers and miners who somehow acquired tanks, artillery, and ammunition. In Putin's version of the world, in February 2022, Russia, by launching a full-scale intervention into Ukraine, did not start a new war, but attempted to end an old war started by Nazi Ukrainian authorities to exterminate Russian-speaking residents and destroy Russia itself. In short, the maniac assaulting the victim tries to convince us that the victim deserved it, because, in his view, she did not lead a sufficiently righteous life. The truth is that the main reason Putin unleashed the most brutal war in Europe in 80 years is his fear of the expanding belt of Euro-Atlantic democratic civilization. The existence of a prosperous and wealthy democracy in Ukraine and other former Soviet states is a temptation for the Russian people, and accordingly, a threat to the Kremlin's brutal dictatorship. The Russian autocrat decided that the only way to stop this threat was a full-scale invasion of Ukraine because all other options, including proxy warfare, had failed. His greatest fear is the accession of Ukraine and other former Soviet states into NATO because the American nuclear umbrella is what prevents the Russian autocrat from destroying countries where it is the people, not tyrants, who choose their country's future. But Putin lied and omitted not only these obvious facts, but many others. He didn't mention how his army committed mass atrocities against children near Kiev, killed at least 8,000 residents of the city of Mariupol, razed the 500,000-strong Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities to the ground, persecutes Ukrainian activists in occupied territories, abducts hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children, and attacks Ukrainian power stations daily only to freeze and drive out as many Ukrainians as possible. On the night of February 10, 2024, the day after Putin's interview was published, during another attack on the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, Russia exploded a local oil storage facility. 7 people died, including a family with 3 small children, the youngest of whom was 4 months old. The mother and children tried to take refuge in the bathroom, but in vain. The fire of Putin's resentment consumed them alive, along with tens of thousands of other Ukrainians. Presenting the interview with Putin, Carlson stated that his duty was to allow Americans to hear Russia's point of view, not just Ukraine's.
Not a single Western journalist has bothered to interview the president of the other country involved in this conflict, Vladimir Putin.
Are we sure that the American people really want to listen to a child murderer? Child murderers should be testifying before the police, prosecutors, and court, not a multi-million audience. When bin Laden killed 3,000 people in the Twin Towers, America destroyed his terrorist network and him. When Putin killed 300,000 people in Ukraine alone, he was given access to an audience of hundreds of millions by the end of the second year of the war. Fortunately, Putin is a poor speaker whose record-breaking dull performance left the English-speaking audience around the world bewildered and disappointed. The dictator, accustomed to sycophants forced to hang on his every word, forgot that this time he was speaking to free people. Someone, for instance, Russian propagandists, might try to convince us that nearly 200 million people watched Putin's interview, citing data from social network X. However, the reality is obviously quite different from this statistic. Social network X's rules state that a view is counted when a post merely appears in front of your eyes. The question should be asked differently. How many people actually found the strength to watch Putin's interview for more than 10 minutes? Carlson and social network X are unlikely to reveal this data to us, but we have at least one relatively relevant indicator: the number of likes. There are fewer than 1 million likes under Carlson's post with Putin's interview, which is only 0.5% of the number of views and 0.3% of the US population. Finally, it's clear that both likes and views come from different countries, not just the US. This means that hardly the number of Americans who could sit through this interview for more than half an hour will exceed a few 100,000. This is nothing in the scale of a political statement that the Kremlin was counting on, especially since the American audience is the target in this case. Thus, if Putin wanted to convince Americans to stop further assistance to Ukraine, this interview most likely did not help solve this task, all because of the deadly boredom induced by the pseudo-historiographical excursions of the Russian despot. The core issue lies not in Putin's capacity to bore, but in his capability to kill with missiles, constructed solely using components exported from the USA and other Western countries, circumventing sanctions. In this context, the only truly important message Putin conveyed to Carlson was, "We have not yet achieved our goal in Ukraine. The question is, what is the goal?" And that goal is not the fight against the non-existent Ukrainian Nazism, it is the complete eradication of the Ukrainian nation, culture, identity, and state as retribution for choosing to step out from under Moscow's boot and move towards the US and Europe. The negotiations Putin ostensibly offers Kyiv are a sham, hiding an ultimatum. Capitulation, meaning Ukraine's renunciation of sovereignty, or the continuation of an existential war. The best proof of Putin's real intentions is that Russian forces have already occupied 20% of Ukrainian territory and have no intention of leaving. That's why Kyiv has officially refused these negotiations, not negotiations with Russia per se, but specifically with Putin. "We do not negotiate with terrorists," emphasize representatives of the Ukrainian authorities. The Ukrainian authorities' decision appears entirely justified, especially when considering the part of the interview where Putin blames Poland, not Adolf Hitler, for the onset of World War II. According to Putin, Poland provoked the war by not wanting to make a goodwill gesture and cede a part of its territory to Hitler, which the Third Reich had claimed. Putin does not merely defend Hitler, he also reaffirms the Kremlin leadership's well-known sympathy for Hitlerism. Essentially, Putin identifies himself with Hitler, blackmailing Ukraine in the same manner Hitler once did with Poland. Territory or war? When we turn to the history of World War II, it's important to remember the following. Unlike Poland, Czechoslovakia did not resist, and the Munich Agreement on the peaceful partition of this country did not prevent the subsequent World War, but only convinced Hitler of Europe's weakness and fueled his appetites for new annexations. Then it was Poland's turn. Poland chose to resist, but what followed is an episode Putin dislikes recalling: the stab in the back to the Poles by Soviet troops who had conspired with Hitler. After the invasion of Poland, Nazi Germany occupied other countries, unleashing the most bloody conflict in history. This is why, recently, chiefs of staff and defense ministers across Europe have been stating that should Ukraine fall, Putin's next targets will be other European countries, from the east to the west. The Russian tyrant, in his conversation with Carlson, repeatedly insisted he would not attack Europe. However, such rhetoric might only reassure the naive, as Putin similarly assured for years regarding Ukraine that he would not annex Crimea, and after annexing Crimea, he claimed he would not take over the rest of Ukraine. Putin understands power, and any attempt to negotiate with him is seen as a sign of weakness. We do not need a new divided Czechoslovakia with another world war. We do not need a new Munich Agreement. We do not need a new Hitler. In Kyiv, Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, Seoul, Ottawa, and Canberra, it's understood what's at stake. It's not just the existence of Ukraine, but that of all humanity. For a beast that has tasted human blood will not stop. Will we allow it?